Well, good morning. Did everybody have a good Thanksgiving, I hope? Yes, we have Thanksgiving has changed at our house a little bit over the last few years. We've started hosting at our house on my wife's side of the family. And the family's not that big altogether, which means we have a lot of leftovers. So as of this evening at dinner time, it will officially been like 72 hours since we've had to cook a meal or clean the dishes from cooking. So I qualify that as a good weekend. But here we are. It's the weekend after Thanksgiving, the Sunday after Thanksgiving. It's kind of this weird space and time, right? It's not quite Christmas yet. It's still a little bit of Thanksgiving. People are still getting together with their families yesterday and today. And we're getting ready to kick off Christmas, but not quite there yet. And so the story we read today kind of exists in the same time. It's almost the Christmas story. It's the story before the Christmas story. It's the lead up to it. It is the story of Zechariah and Elizabeth that we find in the Gospel of Luke. Now, Luke, as a gospel writer, he writes the Christmas story. So does Matthew. They're telling the same story from two very different perspectives, which is to be expected. They're very different people. Matthew comes from a Jewish perspective. He's writing to a Jewish audience. And so when the angel comes to speak, we hear about Joseph's encounter with the angel. Because we know the lineage through that people would have always been done through the father's side. And so we hear Joseph's side of the story to establish Jesus as Joseph's son. But Luke, he's believed to be a Gentile. And so when he writes, he wants to include the Gentiles in his audience. And he has a theme of showing importance to women throughout his writings in Luke and in Acts. And so we hear the Christmas story from Mary's perspective and when the angel visits her. And together they give us this complete picture of the birth story of Jesus Christ. Today's story in Luke, this is the only place that we find this story. And we know that Luke, he's a doctor, a physician, a healer. He's educated, he's intelligent, he's thorough, he's orderly, he's very intentional. And as Luke sets up this story, he gives us a lot of intentional details that we need to understand. If you look up on the slide from the passage you wrote just a minute ago, you'll see it in bold if it sticks out to you. These are the details that Luke drops into this story. I'll give you a second just to look at them. Now we're going to put these all, in case you're one of those people that likes to write everything down, we're going to list these all on a slide for you so they have that for a couple of minutes. But these are all the details listed in verses 5 through 7. Now every one of these details carries some meaning that helps to make this story more rich. But they're packed with information and feelings that a first century reader probably would have understood, but that you and I can read right over. And we might miss it because we weren't alive during that time. What do I mean? Let me give you an example. A story that my dad always told me about when they were younger. They were in their 20s, getting ready to buy their first house. My sister was just a toddler, 2 or 3 years old. And many of you can remember. Some of you have just done it. Some of you maybe are getting ready to do it in the next few years. But the feeling when you buy that first house, it's scary. It's a lot of money. It's a lot of commitment, right? And so they were getting ready to buy this house, and they needed a little help with the down payment. So my dad went to my mom's grandpa, my great-grandfather, Grandpa Lovell. And he went to ask him if they could borrow a little bit of money to make a down payment on their first home. And so he went to their house and said, I asked the question, could I borrow $1,500? And he said, well, sure, I can do that. He said, why don't you come back tonight at 9? My dad thought, well, that's weird, but okay, I must need to go to the bank to get the money or something like that. So he leaves and he comes back that night later at 9 o'clock. He walks in the door and my great-grandfather hands him a flashlight. He says, follow me. Now this is getting weird, right? So he follows him out to the shed in the backyard, picks out a shovel, hands it to him. Says, walk over here, follow me to the north corner, or to this corner of the house right here. I want you to point due north, and I want you to lay that shovel end over end 8 times. Okay, so he lays the shovel end over end 8 times. Gets to the end. Grandpa level says, "Are you sure you're due north of that corner?" "I'm sure." "Okay, now I want you to point to the east. And I want you to lay that shovel end over end 5 times. And I want you to stop." So he goes end over end 5 times, and he stops. "Dig," were the next words out of my grandfather's mouth. So my dad begins to dig. Sure enough, he gets about 2 or 3 feet down. Tink, hits something solid. Digs up a box out of the dirt. Grandpa says, "All right, dust it off. Let's take it in the house." So he takes it. They go into the house. Open it up, and my dad says that there are stashes of $100 bills in this box. Grandpa says, "All right, count 15 of them. Take out what you need." So he counts out 15. Grandpa says, "Let me see that." Counts it, just to make sure. So then Dad goes through the process of just saying, "Thank you, we appreciate it. We're going to pay you back, this amount over time. And, we're going to pay you interest." Grandpa, "Nope, no interest. I don't want any interest. If you want interest, you're not taking it. You pay me back what you borrowed." "Okay, thank you. And then Dad gets up, starts to go. He's like, "I'll go bury this back in the backyard for you." He said, "Wait a second. I'll do that." And as the story goes, there apparently were several boxes in the backyard. And when he moved from that house in his old age, he swore there was one box that he never found. Now, if you are, what was the phrase here? Advanced in years enough to have grandparents or parents who were alive back then during a major event in the time of the world, our country, and really the whole world, an event that would make my grandfather and many of his generation so paranoid about money that he would bury thousands, tens of thousands of dollars in his backyard. That event was Great Depression, right? Now here's the thing. When you read about the Great Depression in the history books, you're not going to hear about people burying money in their backyard, right? You're going to hear about the day it started, what caused it. You're going to hear about unemployment and the suffering that people went through. You're going to hear about fireside chats and World War II bringing the country out of the Depression, and you're going to hear about maybe the banks losing people's money. But what you're not going to read about is the fear, the paranoia that an entire generation of people carried for the rest of their lives. And many of us in this room knew some of those people that never trusted a bank and stashed thousands and thousands of dollars away that their family found later on underneath bed mattresses and blinds and in jars all over the house, right? That's never going to be in the history books. It's only this generation that understands that, the people before us and some of us in the room. And I'm going to guess that some people in the room are too young to even know that story and those stories. Think about us right now today. We've had this giant thing called COVID going on in the last year and a half. I guarantee you when that hits the history books, it's not going to explain that there's an entire generation of people that will spend the rest of their life with an abnormally ample supply of toilet paper in their house. When it hits the history books 100 years from now, we're going to hear about new disease and infection rates and new medicines and maybe the turmoil that goes along with all of it and all that. But we're not going to hear about Zoom calls becoming a way of life and home offices becoming a standard in your home and the paranoia that we felt, maybe not if you weren't afraid of the disease, but you went to the store and there was nothing there. And you thought, what am I going to eat for the next month? This is going to get really weird. Peanut butter and pasta. All right. That's what we got in, But those kinds of details, what we felt, what we carry with us, the history books aren't going to tell that. And that's what's happening in this passage that Luke gives us. He's given us some details that some of those first century readers would have understood and they would have felt. But we, as 21st century readers, 2,000 years later, can read right over them. And every one of these details carries some meaning that helps to make this story more rich. So we have to spend a few minutes looking at these details in order to get a full picture of this story. So here's the first detail. It was in the time of Herod the Great. Now, at first glance, this is simply a statement of timing, historical timing. And it was that. Told us exactly when this happened, right? But there's so much more to this statement. This statement creates a mood. See, Rome put Herod in place. Rome was happy with Herod, which means the Jewish people were not. They saw him as a traitor, and they didn't like that one of their own put in charge of them was more concerned with what Rome thought than their own well-being. They didn't like the Roman rule. You know, this is one of the earliest accounts in the New Testament, one of the earliest stories. Before that, the book of Malachi, where the Old Testament ends, there's a 400-year gap there, a time of waiting. 400 years of waiting for God to move, for the Messiah to come. The next detail is the division of Abijah. This is one of 24 of the divisions of priests. Those are descendants of Aaron, the first high priest of the Israelites. The division included all the men in the line of Aaron, and that sounds like a lot. And we'll get to that later. But it also meant that Zechariah, if he had a son, he would automatically be included in that priestly lineage. Elizabeth, also in the line of Aaron, which means that their son, John the Baptist, John the Baptizer, however you like to refer to him, who would proclaim the coming of the Messiah, was of priestly descent on both sides of his family. And this would further solidify his place in this kind of overarching Jewish religious structure. Again, we see Elizabeth was unable to have a child, as they called it. In the first century, we would have called it barren. And you know, children were seen as one of God's greatest blessings, and to not receive this blessing would have weighed heavily on them. It's likely something that burdened them for their entire life. It was their prayer, day after day, year after year. They were probably looked down upon by people around them. And the thing is, the fault of this in the first century was always put on the woman. And because of this, it would have been acceptable in society for Zechariah to leave Elizabeth because she was unable to provide him with a son, with an heir. And so there's a side note there real quick. Men, if we read the Christmas story and we're not challenged by the character of the men in the Christmas story, we're reading it wrong. You have Zechariah, who could have left his wife, but he did not. You have Joseph, who finds out from the angel that his wife is pregnant, or why his wife is pregnant. And so he gets the explanation, he sees that, but even past that, there would have been judgment around him because not everybody else would have known that story. There would have been confusion from his family members and his neighbors and his friends. And they would have understood if he would have left Mary. But as we know, he did not. And neither of them allowed society to dictate their actions. Because God will always call us, you and me, to be better men than society demands us to be. The next detail is that they were both advanced in years. This is double confirmation that Elizabeth can't have a child. She's barren and she's too old. This makes sure that if and when they have a son, it was without question sent by God. And then it says they are righteous before God, walking blamelessly. Now, Luke is making a very intentional point here. So there was some old Hebrew theology, some old beliefs that being childless was a punishment from God. It was a curse from God, and you were being punished because of your actions, your sinful actions, your unfaithfulness. If you remember the story of Job, when he loses everything and his friends gather around him, and one of the first things that his friends ask him is, how have you sinned? What have you done to bring this on yourself? That was the thought back then. Bad things happened. God put them on you because of what you had done. And it's safe to assume that the people around Zechariah and Elizabeth thought that they were unable to have a child for this very reason. But how could they be punished by God for their actions if they were righteous before God, walking blamelessly in all the commandments and statutes of the Lord? Luke is making sure everybody knows, everybody gets it, that these are good, God-honoring people. They were unable to have a child, but that wasn't because of anything that they had done. And despite their bad fortune, they had continued to faithfully serve God for their entire life. Now, all these details paint a more complete picture of the story as we arrive at Zechariah's big day. His division was on duty. As I said before, his division of Abijah, 8th division of the 24. Lots of divisions, lots of men, right? Think of it like this. Think of a family tree, how it starts small and gets bigger. You have a husband and a wife, and they have 2 kids. And each of their 2 kids has 2 kids. How many kids do we have? 4. Good job. All right. And each of those 4 kids has 2 kids. How many kids do we have? 8. And each of those have 2. We have 16 and 32 and 64. And the tree just gets bigger and bigger and bigger. This is the family tree of Aaron, the first high priest of the Israelites. Every male descendant was included, which means there were literally thousands of them. Their divisions served in the temple twice a year for a period of 1 week. And it was the highest honor, one of the highest honors for the priest to go into the temple and burn the incense. Now, why the incense? What's that all about? Well, think about it. What else was happening in the temple? The burnt sacrifices. Those probably didn't smell good, right? So the incense offsets the smell of the sacrifice. And it was seen by the Jewish people as a pleasing fragrance to God. And so it was a great honor to go into the temple and to offer up this sweet fragrance to God, to please his nose as he received a sacrifice. Now, a priest was only able to do this one time in his life, and there were so many priests that there was no guarantee that you got to do it. They had to cast lots to figure out who was able to do it. And so on this one lucky day, Zechariah, in his old age, was chosen to go into the temple. If you can imagine how hyped up he would have been. He was never guaranteed that this moment was going to happen. And so now it's his day. He's into the temple, moving towards that Holy of Holies, all by himself. No one's around him. Deep in prayer, and he hears a voice. The voice alone probably would have scared him. And then he looks up. And there appeared to him an angel of the Lord, standing on the right side of the altar of the incense. And Zechariah was troubled when he saw him, and fear fell upon him. But the angel said to him, "Do not be afraid, Zechariah, for your prayer has been heard, and your wife Elizabeth will bear you a son, and you shall call his name John. And you will have joy and gladness, and many will rejoice at his birth. For he will be great before the Lord, and he must not drink wine or strong drink, and he will be filled with the Holy Spirit, even from his mother's womb. And he will turn many of the children of Israel to the Lord their God. And he will go before him in the spirit and power of Elijah to turn the hearts of the fathers to the children and the disobedient to the wisdom of the just, to make ready for the Lord a prepared people." Zechariah's prayer, give us a son. He had the hope and the expectation that their son would follow in his footsteps, that he would fear and honor the Lord, that he would be a priest just like his father. There's no greater pride for a God-fearing father than to see his children follow the Lord. So lately, Holly and I have been talking so much that we've been so proud of our son, Luke. He's 12, and he's in the room, so it's awkward right now. But, if you don't want me to talk about you, quit being a good kid. So, but don't be a bad kid, because then I'll talk about you the other way. But we've been so proud of him because he's been killing it at school. And it's been 5 or 6 years since he got anything less than an A on a progress report. For those advanced in years, we used to call those report cards. And in fact, this last one, we were teasing him because he had 2 A's and 5 A pluses. We're like, come on, man, really, an A? You're slacking off a little bit. Like, what, 96%? Ooh, and then just a couple weeks ago, he got invited to this all-region orchestra for middle schoolers. And he's only been playing the viola for a year, and he got invited to this event where students from middle schools all over central Indiana got to go for the day, and there was really only a couple of kids from each middle school. And he got invited to that. And so we're so proud of him for that. He's worked hard, and music's obviously a big deal in our house. And so it's been such a good thing. But a couple weeks ago at church, he was coming in, and as you know, we've been slowly building our children's ministry back into place. And our nursery on that day had a whole lot more kids than it had any other day. And so the volunteers were running, they were trying to keep up, in the nursery. And so one of Luke's grandmas was working in the nursery, and she asked if Luke could help out. So he willingly helped out. And the thing with Luke is he's amazing with little kids. There's actually several moms in the group that refer to him as the baby whisperer. Because he will take a toddler that's just, how they get, and you can't calm them down. And he will distract them, and he will occupy them, and he will relentlessly sustain their attention until the parents show back up. And then they'll leave, and he'll say, oh, I'm so tired. But you would never know it. He does such a good job with little kids. And so he was in there, and we were so proud of him for helping out and doing a good job. And then we go home that day, and we walk in the kitchen, and he says, hey, I didn't get to go to church today, so I'm going to go up to my room and have church and read my Bible. I mean, as a dad, you can get rid of all the A pluses and give me that any day of the week, right? That's what Zechariah's prayer was for his son, that they had hoped that he would follow the Lord, that he would have a God-honoring life. And God's answer was huge. He said this, not only will you have a son, he will be great before the Lord. He will be filled with the Holy Spirit. He will turn many people to the Lord. He will walk in the spirit and the power of Elijah. Now, right there, you got to stop. That's a big name. There is no bigger name for the Jewish people than Elijah. Seen as the greatest of the prophets. If there's a Mount Rushmore for the Jewish people in the Old Testament, Elijah would be on it. And John's son is going to be like him. God says, my son, my Messiah is coming, and your son will get the people ready for him. Your son will point people back towards your God. He will help fulfill the very prophecies that your people have clung to for centuries, and he will pave the way for the long-awaited Messiah. Zechariah, your prayer is too small. You prayed, you begged for the blessing of raising a son, and instead I will have you raise a hero of the faith. How's Zechariah feeling at this moment? Chest out, right? Strutting, dad strutting, my boy, right? My boy is a valedictorian, the captain of the football team, voted most likely to succeed, and he's going to marry the prom queen. Like it's all the things in one, right? That's not his reaction. Zechariah said to the angel, how shall I know this? For I am an old man, and my wife is advanced in years. Zechariah responded in the way many of us would respond if God asked us to be a part of a plan that was too amazing for us to grasp. How shall I know this, he said. I'm not sure this is right. Give me some proof. Zechariah saw his reality, not God's reality. And the truth is, our prayers are oftentimes too small for God's plans. We've just had a 3-year campaign based on this very idea, our Imagine campaign, right? He can do immeasurably more than all we could ask or imagine. So we have to ask ourselves, would I have responded in this same way? Have I created a version of God in my head that is smaller than the actual God? Would I be willing to follow him anywhere at any time? And the angel answered him, I am Gabriel. I think he's saying right there, hey, remember when I told you not to be afraid? Now it's time to be afraid. Okay. Said, I stand in the presence of God, and I was sent to speak to you and to bring you this good news. And behold, you will be silent and unable to speak until the day that these things take place, because you did not believe my words, which will be fulfilled in their time. Gabriel saying, remember the Gabriel that spoke to Daniel in the visions? That was me. I've been around the block a few times. I know some things. And so when I come to you telling you what God's plans are for the future, you might want to take my word for it. But since you think you're smarter than me, I'm going to go ahead and make it so you can't talk for the next 9 months, just to make sure you don't say anything else really stupid. I can embellish that a little bit, but when I read it, that's like the mood I get, okay? I'm sure Gabriel's annoyed. After all, it's not the first time that God has given a child to a family who has begged in prayer. Remember Abraham and Sarah in their old age. Hannah and Samuel, the child that she prayed for. These are stories that Zechariah knew. But all too often, we see possibilities through our eyes and not God's. And when the plan doesn't work out how and when we wanted it to, we fail to see what God is doing. And that's what happened to Zechariah. The angel had to convince him to see it another way. And we can't forget that while all this is happening, there were people outside the temple waiting, praying, and worshiping. It says this in verse 21, and the people were waiting for Zechariah, and they were wondering at his delay in the temple. And when he came out, he was unable to speak to them, and they realized that he had seen a vision in the temple, and he kept making signs to them and remained mute. Now, this part of the story cracks me up a little bit, because Zechariah has been convinced at this point, right? He believes it now, and he wants everyone to know. But he has this punishment. He can't speak. And so the first part is probably easy, you know. I just saw this angel over there, and he was talking to me. Like the people kind of expected it anyways, right? But where does it go from there, you know? He said, my very old wife is going to have a baby. You know, like what? How does he get this point across? Like just imagine. Why could iPhones have not existed yet to record this debacle? We don't hear much about that part of the story. It leaves that scene. And so my guess is it went about exactly as we would guess it went. It says, when his time of service was completed, he returned home. After this, his wife Elizabeth became pregnant, and for 5 months remained in seclusion. The Lord has done this for me, she said. In these days, he has shown his favor and taken away my disgrace among people. A few months later, Elizabeth has the baby. They name it John, just like they were commanded. Because Zechariah can see it now. He sees God's plan. He sees God's timing. And that's the last we hear of them. Their son grows up to be exactly what the angel said he would be. Because of their age, they likely weren't around to see the John that we read about in the New Testament. The man who paved the way for the Messiah. And so we have a few small verses about this unlikely couple and their unlikely story that play a vital role in the birth story of Jesus Christ, and therefore in your faith story and in my faith story. And so we have a few things that we carry away with us from this story, from what we see in Zechariah and Elizabeth. The first one is this: my age does not define God's plan. Say that with me. My age does not define God's plan. Now, we can find examples of this all throughout the scriptures, but we don't have to look any further than the Christmas story. Mary was too young. Joseph was too old. No, Mary was too young. Zechariah and Elizabeth too old. Joseph was right in the middle. And John hadn't even been born yet. Yet God is using all of them to make his plan complete. So whether you're too young to know better, or you're too advanced in years to have the energy or feel like you're still relevant, God has proven over and over again that he will use people from any age, in any stage of life, and any background to carry out his plan. So for the young, be ready. God could call on you at any time. For those that are the opposite of young, he's not done yet. Because you're never too young to be used in ministry. And you are never old enough to retire from ministry. And I don't mean pastoral, vocational, it's your job ministry. I mean the everyday priesthood of all believers kind of ministry. The second thing is that when God asks, we need to be ready and willing. We look at Zechariah's response and Mary's response in the Christmas story. Zechariah said, "Prove it to me." He needed proof. He doubted. Many people believe Mary's response was very different, that it was a response of faith, because she said, "I am willing." Just before that, she said, basically, explain to me how this is going to happen. Two very different responses. They both ended up in God's plan, but one of them made it very much more difficult for himself than he had to. And if God asks you to do something unexpected, what is your response going to be? To doubt? Or to say, okay, God, I'm not sure I understand just yet, but show me how. I'm ready. God's plan is better than our plan, and his timing is better than our timing. Or think of my own story. As a pastor here at Cornerstone, I grew up here at Cornerstone. I remember being in a youth group after I felt called into ministry, and I wanted nothing more than to go to college and come right back here and be a pastor at Cornerstone. I loved my home church. Well, that didn't happen. I went to college, graduated, lived in Muncie, Indiana, on a pastoral staff for 2 or 3 years, and then we found ourselves by a real random set of circumstances in Miami, Florida for 4 years. As you can guess, Miami and Brownsburg are very, very different places. Very extreme in so many ways. And so as we got used to living there, we started to think, man, I don't think I could ever go. Brownsburg's so different from this. Not that I need to live in this, but this is so much different. I'm not sure that I make sense here anymore. And so I began to think, no, I'm not going back to Cornerstone. That's not where I think God's going to take me. That's not what I'm wanting. And then guess what? When I didn't expect it, God brings me back to Cornerstone. And you guys have been stuck with me for 12 and a half years. Right? My timing didn't make any sense, apparently. I had it in my brain the way I wanted it to happen. But God said, no, that's not the right timing. Zechariah and Elizabeth, they wanted a son, but God had more in mind. They wanted it to happen when they were younger, but God was waiting on the right time. We get so wrapped up in time, don't we? Of course we do. We have a start point and an end point when it comes to this life here, right? And that clock's always running. That's kind of always in the back of our mind. But what if you didn't exist in time? What if you didn't have a start point and an end point? Would time be as important? Would you have a different way of seeing time? God was waiting on the right time, the time that he knew, the time that he saw. Did it make sense for them to have a baby in their old age? No, not to them. But did it make sense for John and therefore Jesus to be born at that time? Absolutely. There's evidence of that all around. Even when you think about the Roman Empire, where they lived, one of the most powerful, massive empires in the history of our planet. Now, the Romans had this view of peace, right? We're all going to live in peace as long as you do what I say. And that doesn't sound like fun to live under, but the reality is there was some control during that time. There was a common language that was being spread throughout all kinds of people. There were roads that were being built connecting an entire empire. And it made the scene ripe for the spreading of the good news of Jesus Christ that we find in the book of Acts. It was all perfect in God's time. Zechariah and Elizabeth, they wanted their son to serve as a priest just like their father, to offer up prayers in the temple for the forgiveness of his people's sins, and God was ready to offer forgiveness for all people from every generation. And their son was going to get that story moving. His plan was bigger. His plan was better. His timing was better. God's plan is bigger than our plan, and his timing is better than our timing. And so we trust his plan, and we wait on his timing. That's easier said than done, isn't it? So how do we do that when it's hard? Well, let me ask you this. Do you believe that God is real? Do you believe that he's good? Do you believe that he works for the good of those that will call on his name? Do you believe that he is always working to build his kingdom? When the task is too difficult, when the waiting is too long, and when the obstacles are too overwhelming, we trust in these things. And then we do what Zechariah and Elizabeth did. We serve the Lord faithfully while we wait. And while we're serving, we pray bigger, we wait harder, we trust that God is moving, and we never doubt. God is good. His plans are good. And we never know when he's going to ask us to be a part of those plans. Our job is to walk in righteousness as Zechariah and Elizabeth did, to follow the Lord, to honor him every day, and when he asks, to be ready to jump in and to be a part of his good and his perfect plan. Would you stand with